The best camera settings for portraits are f8, 1/250th of a second, and ISO 100. At least that's a good base point to start from. f8 is going to give you a reasonable depth of field, so your portrait's going to be sharp. 1/250th of a second is going to help you prevent any camera shake or motion blur if your person moves. And ISO 100 is going to give you a good technical quality picture. But because every situation you're going to take a portrait in could be different, you can't always rely on these settings. And your intention, your creative input into a portrait might not always require these specific settings. So let me explain why. Every portrait can be quite different. Sometimes you'll just want a real close-up picture. Other times you'll want to include the person's full body. So of course the settings you choose are going to be different. The lens you choose could be different as well. And this is going to affect things like depth of field and possibly the aperture setting, the widest aperture setting you can use, because that varies from lens to lens. And of course the other key factor in camera settings for your exposure particularly is what's the light like. Here I'm sitting in soft light, it's a sunny day, but I'm in the shade. That's going to be a lot different than if I was taking portraits in the full sunshine, or if I was making a portrait at night. And then you've got to factor in whether you're using accessories like a flash or a reflector. And your intent for the portrait is also really critical. Do you want a shallow depth of field? Do you want a deep depth of field? Do you want a lot in focus or nothing in the background in sharp focus? Do you want to expose for the highlights and let the shadows go dark and black and moody? This is going to really change the effect of the portrait that you're making and change the mood and the atmosphere of the portrait that you're making. You've got to think of how the photo is going to be used. If you're taking a portrait of somebody for their business website, they might have specific requirements. They want a nice, evenly lit photo. Or maybe if they're an artist or a musician, they're going to want something a bit more interesting, a bit more creative with a bit of bite to it, so you can vary your exposures and use different lighting and things like that. So in each of these situations, your camera settings will need to be somewhat different to achieve what you want. And so knowing what you want is going to govern what camera settings you use. But one of the key things to think about is how much do you need in focus? Usually you're going to want to focus on the person's eye, and then consider how much of the rest. Do you want their nose in focus? Do you want their ears in focus? This is pretty typical for portrait photography, but it's not always necessary. You can get really creative, turning someone to the side and just focusing on one eye so the other one's out of focus. There's no set hard and fast rules, so there's no set guideline for exactly what camera settings are best for portraits. There are just so many options, there's so many possibilities, but as a base, stick to f8, 2/50th of a second, and ISO 100 if there's enough light. If there's not enough light, maybe jump your ISO up to 400 or ISO 800 in lower light situations, or even higher if you need to. And these settings are going to be pretty safe to capture a good portrait that's well in focus and without risking motion blur. If you'd like to know more detail about this, check out the article on our website on photographycourse.net. And if you really want to learn more, check out our 365 Days of Photography course. Module 13 is all about portrait photography. It goes way deeper than just the camera settings. It goes a lot more into the creative side of photography and about how to really connect with your subject so that you can get a really dynamic, interesting portrait every time. Thanks for watching.